Well, good evening to you. A week's a long time in politics, but that is particularly the case when there is a general election where the whole political landscape can change in the case of just a few hours. While that wasn't quite the case last Thursday, there were certainly landmark moments, a number of key changes, the true significance of which we'll discover in the months ahead, of course. Manifesto launches, TV and radio debates, set-piece interviews, key features of the campaign, all of them as would-be politicians set out their policies through the lens of the media. But what role did the media play in the results? Did the media define and shape people's choices? Were the online sources more important? How did social media affect the tone and substance of the debate? And what was it like, most crucially, for those reporters and journalists at the coalface themselves? Well, over the next hour or so, we hope to find out as the Royal Television Society, the Isle of Man branch, brings together some of the main media organisations on the Isle of Man to discuss how they covered the election and what impact their coverage had. On behalf of the Isle of Man branch, it's great to be joined by a group of media colleagues, in many cases friends as well, for an in-depth look at the election coverage from the Manx media's perspective. I can see Manx Radio's election guru hot-footing it off air just a few moments ago, Andy Wint, from Isle of Man TV, Paul Moulton, ITV Granada's man in the Isle of Man, Josh Stokes, Sam Turton from Jeff the Mongoose, busy period for Jeff, of course, and broadcaster and founder of Energy FM, Ewan Turner. Good to see you, chaps, and welcome one and all. Let's take it away. In fact, let me begin by asking you, and I'll put this to Andy first of all, if I may, and then to all of you very quickly, just about the results. First of all, obviously the elections, as much, if not more so, about personalities than policies. So now the dust has settled. Perhaps there were a few surprises in the 1-2 orders in some constituencies, but Andy, did any results really shock you, do you think?
The one thing that hit me, and I suppose we should have all seen it coming, the fact that there were relatively few female candidates, but a vast proportion of them got elected. So now there are a lot more female representatives in the House of Keys. And I think that was always going to come. I didn't think it would come quite as quickly as it did. And I was quite disappointed in the number of female candidates in some of the constituencies, but that one did. And also, I mean, the other thing is that years ago, being a government minister was often a passport to an easy ticket to a seat in the House of Keys. And the fact that four ministers were unceremoniously emptied, and Dr. Allinson lost over 800 votes in Ramsey. I mean, ministers now must think that, you know, they've got a poison chalice, because if they have an unsuccessful department, they're actually seen as responsible. And I mean, for four ministers to go, was the one I was most surprised by was Mr. Harmer, Ray Harmer, because he was a very well-known and very well-regarded ex-commissioner and MHK and PL. I was surprised Ray Harmer was out, but I mean, those are the two things: female representation and the booting out of ministers.
Well, thanks, Andy. What about you, Ewan? Because obviously, as Andy alludes to, I believe, and I know we're not talking about personalities personally here, but I believe Mr. Harmer is quite, it's hit him quite badly, I believe.
Yes, I mean, we saw. I mean, Ray, he's an incredibly nice man, and his heart's in the right place. But I don't entirely agree with this thing about ministers. If their departments are failing, it's down to them. I'm sorry, they need to control their civil servants, and clearly there are some departments that's just not happened. And what you need is ministers in there who are strong and can actually say no to them. And I think that's the problem. The ministers that have gone, that was the problem. They just weren't strong enough to control their officers.
Thanks, Stuart. Sam, in terms of surprises, were there any major surprises, major casualties for you?
I suppose one of the big surprises for me was Martin Perkins showing in Garth. I think that more had to do with he was pretty much the only candidate to support the sewage solution proposed by the government in the area, and I think that's it was an interesting one to see a local issue which has had a national issue which has had local ramifications, because it's a local issue as well. But I think the minister wise, I think that the former chief ministers on the radio actually was spot on with it, where if the election had been a year ago, we probably would have seen all of Coleman back in. Whereas now some of the shine's come off, and as June says, a lot of the departments are seen as failing. There's issues in all departments, but ones where civil servants are seen as running the roost a little bit for the past couple of years has really led to the downfall of some of their ministers.
But this is nothing new, Paul, though, is it? You know, that relationship between ministers and civil servants, it's age old.
Well, let's just talk about the elephant in the room for a second. Let's talk about the promenade works. For people who don't know the Isle of Man, there's been a massive amount of work on the main centre of Douglas, and it's taken a lot longer than anticipated. But I think the question was being asked, would that minister, and we're talking about Tim Baker, would things in Douglas reflect what was happening up in Erin Michael? Would that affect his result, or was he a strong local candidate? And I think he thought that as well, that he was strong on local issues. So it plays out. I mean, Harmer as well. He started the promenade going. God, that slipped. And of course, he got all these cheers 5 years ago. Literally, he put some tarmac down. Didn't matter what it was. He got massive amount of credibility for that. But then it all slid away, and then he gets moved out of the department. And I think people do take that into consideration. I mean, and the other thing to talk about here is that the vote was down, wasn't it? Overall, I think we were talking about less people voted this time, which just shows you people aren't engaging.
Well, that's interesting. You mentioned that's one of the outcomes that surprised you, and we'll talk about that shortly. Josh, what were your first impressions, if you like, from a media perspective of an Isle of Man general election?
Well, I think that you say what surprised people. I mean, for me, as someone who's reporting on it for a first time in probably the region of Granada, watching it, the surprise really was how big this is for the Isle of Man. You know, the fact that the Isle of Man elects 24 people to represent them around the whole island for the population size. That was certainly a surprise for a lot of our viewers, I think, around there. And I think echoing what Andy said, you know, the amount of women that have been elected into the House of Keys this time round, and the fact that 4 ministers did indeed lose their position in Parliament. You know, things like that are quite rare to happen all in one for people in our region, in particular in the Northwest, watching an election unfold in their eyes in a very small region.
Okay, well, thank you for all your impact there, and what perhaps an indication of some of the results that surprised you. We know direct communication's vital, door-to-door campaigning, leaflet drops, social media adverts, promotions, etc. Money spent on that. But June, I mean, you've obviously experienced the number of elections with various media over several decades. So how much of an impact does Manx media have on the final outcome, do you think?
Well, it does have an impact. I mean, some of the programs we produced of the election shows, people did say they weren't quite sure how they were going to vote, and those programs did help people sort of decide. But I think on the whole, most people know, don't they, before they go, who they're going to vote for. So I think it does have a help, without a doubt, and people will take an interest in a lot of the things that are going on, whether it be the media coverage or whether it be the local meetings that are held around the island. I must admit, I didn't even know the local meeting was on in my area, which I was disappointed about. So it's maybe they need to take a look at that. But I think on the whole, a lot of people have a good idea who they're going to vote for before the hustings season even kicks off, to be honest.
Paul, is it more about personalities than policies now, or has it always been the case?
Well, you see, June there saying it doesn't make much difference about, maybe not as much difference as it should do. But I think what he did, for instance, Studio One, doing those things, I did one-to-one interviews, Manx Radio done interviews. I think there's never been more interaction between potential MHKs and the public. And I think, from what I've heard, people do take notice of how they react to these interviews. Obviously, maybe better still if they're in an actual room together. But it's been very interesting, hasn't it? That there's been so much media attention, and it's only going to get more as time goes on. But I really think, from what I've heard back, people watched these things and actually did make up their minds to some degree on where their vote was going. I mean, clearly, some people, sorry, probably going to questions you're going to have later, but some people didn't even put themselves up for an interview at all, which is quite incredible. People standing as an MHK, and they won't do an interview, they won't do any media. They probably just about did the requisition meetings, but it's a funny old game out there. Really,
interestingly, none of those select few were elected. I don't think anyone will be surprised to hear last week. Andy, I mean, Paul makes a point there about the meetings that we had. What did we have? We had various media debates and public meetings. Some, but not all, were poorly attended. Was it diluted too much, or should we applaud the fact that the election coverage this time was probably spread over more providers than ever before in the Isle of Man?
I think it's symptomatic of a proliferation of media. 20 years ago, there was just Manx Radio. Now there are 3 radio stations, various internet operators, social media people. We've still got the newspaper, but obviously that's declining in influence because newspapers are dying all over the world. So in terms of media, there's a lot of media. I think the problem is whether people are engaged. I think the people who are engaged are very engaged. And I think we're missing, and I was watching like a hawk, as I know lots of other people were, the turnout figures. And we still have lots of people who are in denial about the fact they're on the Isle of Man. Lots of people look at the Isle of Man with a northwest of England template and think they're in some way we're allied to Bolton or Cumbria. And I think there are lots of people on the Isle of Man who are truly ignorant of the political process. Now, whether or not that's for politicians or media, personally, and it's a question I've put to whenever we've done outside broadcasts in schools, nobody teaches Manx politics in schools. So why are we surprised when 16-year-olds don't know the importance of the House of Keys or Ledgeco or what Hango Hill represents or who Iliam Doan is? So if we're not teaching it in school, how can we expect 16-year-olds to vote?
Well, thanks, Andy. I mean, let me come to Sam then, because Sam, I remember interviewing you when you were a sixth form student, and it's probably about 8-9 years ago now, and you were one of the students protesting outside Timble about the introduction of tuition fees, and that's, in fact, that's where I met you and a few others. So, I mean, obviously age defines what media voters consume, but how do you get around that? I mean, would Manx politics in schools help, or is it literally an age-old factor that apart from a small percentage of people, it's only as you get older that you take more of an interest in politics, wherever you are?
I think, I mean, if we go back to the thing that we had for tuition fees with the soon-to-be 2 previous governments ago, it was a case of that for a lot of people, they got involved with politics for the first time. There was a group of us who were very keen on politics anyway, but a lot of people got involved the first time, and what they saw was that they were completely ignored, and things were brought in anyway. So that wasn't perhaps their best first experience. I spoke to in fact, my old politics teacher, the head of social sciences in Ian's, Sarah Christopher, where she said that when they get to sixth form, they can do politics, but it's all UK curriculum. And I think if you want to look into things of schools, I mean, that's just not a political issue. That's beyond just politics. I mean, Manx history is taught to an extent in schools, but then we have to switch on to the UK curriculum when it starts to get a bit older. So you can say we don't teach politics in schools. We don't teach much Manx in schools, really. There's not enough. I don't think there's enough based on what Manx culture is that would actually boost towards that. And just picking up on what Duran said, which is I think probably the first time I've agreed with him twice in more than 20 minutes, but the government hustings were an absolute disaster. I mean, the 2 best ones I went to, we went to all around the island, and the best 2 of every constituency, the best 2 was Ayr and Michael, which had a really good turnout, which followed on from Derby having the biggest turnout in the local authority elections. And then you have Russian, where there was a really good turnout. I think the turnout on the election was quite good, but also they hadn't had local authority elections down there. So it became a night for people to vent about local issues instead of national issues. So I think that you can't just look at this election in isolation and say there's a problem. There's a wider problem with political engagement on the Isle of Man, which comes from societal engagement.
Was it too diluted, though, the series of public meetings, the series of media debate on a number of channels?
I think that the government set their mind to something and didn't consider that other people were going to do their own thing. I mean, you also had the captains of the parish weren't really on board with this new system they created, so they were complaining about it. And I just think that it was one of these things where they thought about something and went, let's do that. And they never thought about things like Studio One doing their own things. They never thought about Manx Radio doing theirs. So instead of perhaps looking at, they could have brought us all in January, sat us down and gone, right, as a media, let's be serious. What would you all think could work? And when we could come out of the meeting squabbling and not have an answer, but at the same time, we could have actually put our heads together and thought, this is something that we could do to make this work across the island. So we don't end up with a situation where you turn up at a meeting, there's 35 people in a room, and without being rude to any of the voters or candidates, me and Noah, who did the rest for us, we were dragging the average age down considerably.
Well, Josh, tell me, I mean, before you moved to the island, what, 3 years or so ago, did you vote? Did a lot of your friends, when they were in their late teens, early 20s, did they vote, or was that not the norm?
I think it's an issue across the board, really. There seems to be getting the young engaged in politics in some ways has been hard across both, you know, the rest of the UK and the Isle of Man, by the sounds of things. But obviously, things work a lot differently over in the UK in terms of trying to galvanise the vote, and sometimes some ways have worked. Politicians have tried ways of doing things. You know, Jeremy Corbyn was going for his vote. He really tried to focus on getting the young vote for him and the Labour Party. So there's different strategies and techniques that work. But just coming back to a point that I think we're all making really is that I thought it was really interesting that after a pandemic, when politicians, particularly on the Isle of Man, have been in the forefront of, you know, the media and the public, and you think about the press conferences and all those politicians that have come to the forefront of people's minds, my gut instinct would be the turnout would naturally be higher because people have been more engaged in how politics works on the island through the pandemic, because that's, you know, galvanized all of us in many ways. And yet there's been so much choice of where people can hear the different candidates across loads of media outlets, and yet the turnout has been so low. So that's been something that's particularly been surprising for me.
Andy, traditionally that the mainstream media, as you said, has set the agenda, as any media worth its salt should. But the growing significance of social media can play a vital role in informing and priming public opinion during elections. Does this affect the approach you and other established mainstream media take during a campaign? Does that affect the approach that Manx Radio took this year? Because obviously, I think the station's approach changed this year and was wider, if anything, than perhaps in previous elections.
There was a lot more social media from Manx Radio. There's a lot more videos and a lot more engagement where that was concerned. Certainly loads more videos. But remember, traditional broadcasters, we're governed by statute. So we have to follow the rules. So obviously Energy, ITV, 3FM, anything they do when nominations close, we're very much governed by what we can say and can't say. So the lines have been blurred. So when you get internet operators and social, you know, the public doesn't understand that on the internet, it's the Wild West. And the fact that if we put a foot wrong, I did 12 outside broadcasts in the constituencies, and I had to be live for an hour, had to be fair to everyone. Everyone had to get the same amount of time. I couldn't be seen to favor anyone. Any questions had to be put purely to the panel of candidates, not any individual candidates. And people were saying, why aren't you quizzing the minister? Well, that's not what it's there for. And under statute, you simply can't do that. So in the Wild West internet, of course you can do whatever you want. It's not regulated by anybody, apart from under laws of slander and blasphemy.
Well, let me come to that, Paul, because obviously both worlds are deeply connected, but some people will naturally be concerned about being able to distinguish between real and false information on the net during the election. We've all seen it, let's be honest. So how can that be avoided, or is it here to stay, even if tougher regulations for online providers become law? How do we avoid what we've seen in recent weeks in certain cases?
Well, let me go back to Andy. So about the Wild West of the internet, I think the Isle of Man's media, and I'm an internet person, and Jeff is, and that sort of thing. I think we've all held ourselves in the best light. We've held ourselves very responsible. I've done interviews that made sort of 10 minutes long. I could have done 15 with one and 5 with other. I don't believe what I call the people that are here tonight, the established media, albeit now it's a new media. I think everyone's taken the job exceptionally seriously and tried to be as fair and regulated as anybody else. Sorry, slightly going off what your question was, but you understand it's very important, I think, that we do behave ourselves just like any other media.
Yeah,
and
but,
yes,
but clearly the mainstream media and a lot of the others did. Clearly there were one or two online who didn't.
But you're
how-
talking about people who aren't necessarily a media,
and they're not necessarily media. No, of course not. We all
anyone
saw
can
it.
say anything on the internet, and that is absolutely the problem. Yes.
However, the consumer doesn't discern. To them, it's just coming on the smartphone. So I can, Energy FM's output and videos can come out of the smartphone as a guy in a bedroom in Ramsey libeling somebody.
Are we talking about takeover TV sort of thing here? I mean, there's, for people who don't understand it, there's a very sharp-witted group of people who are producing small, succinct videos, which are running on platforms. They certainly take things quite a long way. It'd be akin to spitting image, I believe. That's how I would see it. It's a very, very Manx way of setting the Michael out of people. Andy, is that what you're thinking of? Those sort of people?
Well, clearly it is. I mean, Julian, what was your stance? You know where I'm leading on this. Takeover TV was certainly one. People's personal opinions on Facebook and other social media were another. I mean, there's a polarization here, and it's dangerous, isn't it?
Well, it can be, but as Paul says, you've got to take it into context. I mean, the whole takeover TV thing, I mean, we seem to, when we produce the Studio One material, seem to give them hours of content to hop around and do things. In one respect, but some of those, as you say, some of them are quite funny, humorous, maybe a bit of what some of us are thinking. But then some of them did seem to go a little bit further than that. And that's the thing about unregulated media. I would hope that the average person can see the difference. But as you quite rightly say, or as Andy said, some of it can look quite legitimate and people believe it. I mean, you see it when people start sharing photographs and then everybody starts to share it and they go, well, actually, this was in 2015. So, the traditional media does have a very important part to play about trust. And I think that's where we come from, that everybody certainly on the panel tonight are local people working in the media, whether it's online or on traditional media, are well-known faces in the community that people trust. And you only have to abuse that trust once by your viewer or listener or reader, and you're finished. So I think that's why everybody has done their best to be as fair as they possibly can.
Did certain media, Sam, did certain media dumb down? Was there sufficient evaluation to explain policies, fact check politicians, or was the job of certain media to literally make the election more interesting and accessible to all? And I'm not talking about Jeff specifically here, but I'm just putting that question to you.
I think, well, if you take what we did with because we set up the website 2021.im, which we did it as, we wanted to make it a more visual graphic. We wanted to make it as a very, essentially make it as a basic point for people to say, look, here's what the core beliefs of candidates are. Here's their manifesto. Go and read it. And I thought we took our approach more as we were the first step on the ladder to people, or an introduction to here these people are, and here's where you can read about them. I don't think any of the media took a dumbed down approach. I think realistically we all took a similar approach. Manx Radio did the Top Trumps style format, which I thought was really quite good with the layout. The papers did the questionnaire, and I think there's it's easy to say that there's a lot of differences between how the traditional and the online Wild West that me and Paul live in presented things. But I just think that we presented the same things. We just did it in a slightly different manner with probably brighter colours.
Did you detect, Paul? I mean, I certainly did. Did you detect cautiousness from some journalists and indeed government departments who probably, in fairness, clearly didn't know the regulations of rules of who can speak and who can be put forward once nominations have closed? Because I know you, for one example, you didn't interview any politicians, even if they were ministers, past a certain point. Obviously, you were being cautious. And other media adopted the same approach. Some government departments didn't even know their own regulations. So how do you balance that?
Well, I think I talked to a minister because it was something to do with, while he's still in job, but certainly I would try and keep them off the air just to keep it balanced. I mean, even when we went to the school, I didn't have any of them in shot because I just thought, just trying to keep things balanced. But as for who can talk and who can't, I mean, I don't know what you can say to that one. I mean, the fact is, these ministers are still in positions, and we should still be talking to them technically, even though some of them, 4 of them, are now no longer got the public confidence / the vote.
Josh, do you think politics is more accessible now?
I think absolutely. I think at this point, that I mean, as I was saying, there's especially with this election here, there's been so many different media outlets offering some kind of connection to politics, and even the not traditional media are talking about politics in some way. So there's so much information out there about politics and ways of finding out about it. And if anything, I think those other alternative accounts, shall we say, or alternative organizations that are using politics over here to make their own content, has made our content even more important in many ways. The traditional media that we are, in terms of, putting the clear, concise facts out there, and that's more important than ever. It's particularly in elections, and our job as media organizations is to stick to those guidelines, stick to those rules, and the public know that they can come to the likes of us to get those facts. And that is our role at the end of the day. And having those alternative accounts, I think we should give the public some credit in many ways to say, the public on most accounts know where they can get their facts more so than anywhere else. That's why we're here. That's what we do, and most people know that, I think.
A question that's just come in. I'll put this to Andy first, if I may. Generally, voters tend to be older, we're told. So is modern social media passing quite a lot of them by, and they aren't necessarily getting a varied viewpoint that this questioner has asked?
Yeah, without doubt. Obviously, older people tend to favour traditional media, and younger people, it's their way of life. Any kids born within the past 30 odd years live and breathe social media. They've all got the favourite, and of course some social media's come and gone. So there has to be a way of engaging the younger voter. There has to be a way. Now, it may be that people don't get interested in voting until they've got a marriage and a mortgage, until certain things to become a lot more important to them, and they don't see the point of politics. But I just think that there has to be an engagement, there has to be an offering from all the media to make politics interesting. I'm a great believer in the fact that you don't have to be solemn to be serious, and you can do politics with a twinkle in your eye without demeaning it. And I think lots of the politicians simply don't get that. They're a bit pompous, and they don't understand that. And I think that's partially why there's been a lot more women, in that they can be very personable and yet be very serious. I'm particularly looking forward to their performance in Keys. So yeah, I think, but that's an existential thing with social media. Nobody quite knows where social media is going to end up. And this whole debate between is social media, are they publishers or are they content creators? What do they actually do, and who's in charge? That's an argument all over the world, and we're just part of it.
I want to just talk about election night itself now, because I'll come to you first, Sam, if I may, because clearly a lot of effort went into the Jeff night. You had a lot of fun ventures. Cooked chili with Sam, I think Pin the Key on the Candidate was one I saw, the cocktail, all good fun. In fact, at one point, if you thought getting up close and personal with Sam was a treat, can you imagine what it was like for me keeping an eye and an ear on all the media treatments and seeing Paul twice in different places at the same time? That was quite an experience as well. But do you really did what you offer as Jeff? Do you think it hit the mark with your target audience?
Yeah, I think we did. I think we what we wanted to do is take some of the seriousness out of things and knock it down a little bit, because realistically, once the polls close, it can be a bit more of a circus. I think the election would benefit if it was more of a circus and we had more candidates standing during the campaign. I think there was some constituencies where the campaigning was rather dull, to be honest. And I think we sort of took the approach of let's not Americanize it, but sort of take a bit more fun and put a bit more colour onto things and see what we can do. And this is how we came up with the election night coverage, which was hosted by myself and Jack Divers, who did an incredible job for somebody who by his own admission doesn't engage in politics much, but he's fantastic at what he does, and he's a brilliant host for that. And I think from our point of view, we took it and presented to people, and looking at the results that we've seen on our demographics and our viewing figures, I think that we did exactly what we wanted to do, and with any luck, there's things we can do better. Obviously, there was. Maybe we can have more or less of Paul. That's up for people to decide in a few years' time. But yeah, I thought I think we just presented things in a far better way, which is a lot more fun.
Can I say that I thought yours was like Channel 4's version, Sam, wasn't it? If you can't join the mainstream, which would be people watch BBC One regardless of what happens, you were the Channel 4 alternative.
Oh yeah, I mean, I didn't see anybody else jumping into a river to chase after a duck that you've written Jason Morehouse on the back of. So, from that point of view, yeah, we're supposed to take that.
Just on that, I mean, there was some criticism, and you'll always get that. Of course, you were, because Jeff was so behind the curve with declaring the result. In fact, I think you signed off when there were still 4 or 5 results constituencies to come. So can you learn from that, or does that actually miss the whole concept of the Jeff coverage?
No, I think that's something we can learn from. I think there's obviously elements of what we can do different, like I've said, and that's something that we can look at. But I think even when we moved away from being live online, we still kept the results going.
Yes.
I mean, Emma and Kate were churning, and Paul Spell, they were churning out results till 20 to 3 in the morning. We were still doing the pages and updating things here. So it's not a case to say just that we finished at 11:15 or 11:20 whenever we finished. Things kept whirling beyond that. Could we have stayed on longer? That's something we can look at. But we'd made a plan for what was about a 3-hour live broadcast, which was something which started off as an idea that we had a few months ago, and we realistically didn't have any expertise in this at all. We had Ben, who's worked in BBC, and that was about it in terms of our company. I thought we did really well for a first attempt, and it's something that we can build on.
Paul, you obviously back up at Manx Radio. You seem to be in your element there, actually. You revelled in the opportunity. That was hosted by Andy and Beth Espy, of course. What did you make of the coverage? Because it's a massive undertaking and a big team effort, isn't it?
I was very grateful to be asked up to Manx Radio. Thank you, Andy and Beth, for inviting me, because I don't often get an outing. And of course, the trouble is, like, Andy asked me a question, and I have no filters, and I realised I can be dangerous with answers. I was watching the other outputs. Obviously, Studio One's the interesting one. Juan's involved with that. Juan Turner. Is that the future of where it's going to go? I mean, that's a studio-based shiny floor sort of look almost to it. The radio was definitely radio with pictures. Jeff was, as I said, like the Channel 4 sort of furry things, a lot of furry things going on in there, and lots of inserts and gentle ribbing and laughter to take you through the night. And in fact, the Studio One was interesting because they had the cameras everywhere during. I think you almost had all of them, didn't you? Which I thought that added an extra interest to actually see these people, winning or losing. It's quite interesting to see their faces, and I think that's something definitely you'll see more of.
Well, it's interesting you say that. That's a new dimension. I was going to ask you, Juan. I mean, the Studio One set up the production side highly professional. First, in many ways, what did your team learn, and what is the future covering politics, let alone elections, in that way? Because again, like Manx Radio, massive team, and it's not cheap to do.
No, it's not cheap. Well, it can be. It can be a lot cheaper. I think the whole election process on the Isle of Man is a complete shambles, to be honest.
In what way?
I've covered the likes of Scottish elections for ITV, and also UK elections back in my days. And in the Isle of Man, you're sworn in to the counts, where you're then basically bound and gagged in the corner and not allowed to talk about anything, or like we decided not to be sworn in because we didn't want to be stuck inside for hours and hours and hours in case we had to go elsewhere. So we made a conscious decision that our camera teams would remain outside for when the doors open. But the problem is the returning officers, you'd get very little information coming out, and then they'd open the doors. Now, what happened in the count I went to was, because of the lack of rules allowing this cooperation, you couldn't take proper broadcast cameras there to get a proper link back because you just didn't have time to set them up. So you were relying on using people watching this who use some of the software like vMix will know what it is, but vMix Call, to start up an iPhone to get the live pictures back. Now, from a viewer's point of view, you want to see what's going on. from our point of view as a production company, we wanted to get the best quality pictures and the best quality sound. Now, you can't really do that with an iPhone. It's better than nothing. But what happened at Ayr was we were stood outside the front of the church hall for 3 hours waiting to go in. The door was ajar and a lady just put her head through and said, "Can we come in yet?" And everyone had gone. They'd all gone out the back door to do the declaration.
Now tell me, is that, I sympathise with what you're saying there, but isn't that the onus of you or the organisation at the time to make sure you're represented at all 12 counts, even though I admit it can be a long night?
No, we were represented at all 12 counts.
No, but through the night though.
No, but you're not allowed to do anything at them. Now, in the UK, when I've covered Scottish elections, you're in the hall, the counting is going on right over there where you're not interfering with it, it's behind the barrier, but you journalists can do pieces to camera, you can link into the studio and say, well, it's all going on behind me, so-and-so's in trouble, they might be losing the seat tonight, you know, and all of this sort of thing. In the Isle of Man, you're stuck out in the car park where it's dark and you can't do anything. If you are signed into the count, you still can't do anything. So
can I just jump in there, because I've done many, and you can, but it's all down to the returning officer. They all have their own understanding of the rules, and
the majority
done it,
of
but
them
you don't
said no. And
Well,
in one case, they even had the windows barriered off so nobody could look in them.
Well, that is down to individual returning officers, as Paul alludes to, and I think that's always been the case. But we can, presumably, media, lessons can be learned from that ahead of the next time that there's a contest or a by-election, dare I say. Josh is nodding there. Josh, have you covered elections before you moved to the Isle of Man?
I was just going to say, yeah, so I was actually at the recent general election in the UK, and I was at Bury, doing Bury South, and it was, as Julian explained there, so we were all on a balcony in a big hall, all the media was lined up there, and they were doing all the counting in front of us, and we had that, there was still that barrier there to know that the media were being trusted to stick to the rules that we've all learned and we're all here for, because we've done that training. That's why we are the traditional media and professionals. We were all trusted to be up on that balcony and do our thing while returning officers and all that did their thing down below. It was all done within procedure, and everyone knew where they stood. And that was the kind of difference, I think, that I was surprised about here, and that it felt very different depending on what constituency you were in. Whereas there definitely feels to be a standardized view in the UK of how it should work, and everyone understands that and sticks to those rules. And there just seems to be that trust there in the UK that perhaps wasn't so frequent here, having seen it go on.
Sam?
Well, just on that, I mean, if you don't think of it, if you want to take somebody else's word for it than ours, read the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association report. They've been over here for the past 2 weeks. They made it very clear there's a lack of training for staff. There was differences between deputy returning officers, between what was allowed and what wasn't allowed. There was difficulties in polling stations in terms of disabled access as well, but that's beyond the thing for just in terms of this discussion. But I mean, it's not just us saying this. This is people who have come over to observe the election who have said there are issues which need addressing. So, I mean, we're obviously wanting better access for the media, but you've got professionals who have come in from around Europe who have gone, this doesn't work. And there isn't enough training for deputy returning officers and their staff. And you need consistency to make an election work. And we can't have a situation where Douglas South and Douglas North have two completely different rules.
Well, I think it was probably one of Martin Perkins's last acts, actually, before he lost his seat, but he brought forward this, I think £40,000 is being spent on this CPA mission, and the full report, of course, is to come in November or so. So I think it might be a very different landscape we experience in 5 years. Thankfully, a very different landscape, Andy, to what happened 5 years ago, where in 2 counts, extra boxes were found and results had to be, that were looking one way, went the other way. On the whole, this time was fairly smooth. What about from a Manx radio perspective? Did everything work for you as you wanted? Because obviously you've got to be very alert for 7-8 hours on air. What worked, what perhaps didn't?
Most things worked, and we're effectively 12 outside broadcasts, obviously, with via boxes and Lucy's here, there, and everywhere. Just going back to what the returning officers, there were lots of phone calls here made when we'd heard from the returning officers. You can't bring phones in, so you couldn't actually take. And we had to literally sit down with some of the returning officers and say, look, we do actually need a phone. these aren't frivolous items. We do need a phone because we'll be WhatsApping and we'll be texting. We're not going to be streaming live video. We just want to use a phone. And eventually they all agreed, but it was just an interesting process to go through.
That must be frustrating because it's almost antiquated, because you'll have covered elections, and Juan and Paul certainly will, 15 years ago, where you could bring your phone into certain counts. So is that an education issue for returning officers, chaps?
But I think it's also because the fact that the phone is much more now. Years ago, it was just a mobile phone. Now the returning officers know that you can stream a video from a phone, and they know that. So I think they were being overcautious, and basically it boiled down to almost a lack of trust, in that they didn't think that we were just going to take, and particularly originally we were going to have four of our Politibabble correspondents, the youth politics thing we do. And it's almost like they didn't trust them. They're 16-year-old high school students, and it's almost like they thought they were going to play the Aunt Nance and do something wrong in the count, and nobody was going to do that. So it's interesting to see how the dynamics work. But in terms of Manx Radio over the show, everything was fine. Everything was, even Cotty behaved himself.
He had a late night as well. Tell me, Paul, anything that you, I mean, we've heard from the chaps, the panel, Juan as well, and Andy, anything you personally would like to see improve next time that potentially could make your job easier?
Well, I think it's carrying on from what's been said here. I cannot understand why all the returning officers are not brought together and given a Bible to say, this is how it's done. If you listen to them all coming one by one coming on, they all handle it so differently. Just the results service. I mean, one returning officer thanked, I think his children, his grannies, anybody was being mentioned. It doesn't look good on a larger scale how we don't quite get it, and listening to what Josh said there, clearly other places have more interaction with the media, and it should be much more a two-way street. And this could go on in another direction altogether. I'm not going to go there, but you know what I mean? Just interaction and getting things sorted beforehand. I mean, at least this time, Manx Radio, for instance, could hold the count. I mean, I remember years ago, I was at Michael and we just had a phone, and I literally held them up, and it had never been done before. And there was this real gasp that I said, "Can you just wait while we wait for somebody else?" Because they would just announce it. So there is a movement there. There was definitely, let's wait until Manx Radio is ready for us, and we'll do the count, which was helpful. So there was no need for missing anything. And it was, I think, on the night, Manx Radio would still be the go-to place probably for that thing. But as time goes on, the Studio One productions, the Jeff productions, and anybody else who's just got a phone, what were there 4 different shows this year? In 5 years' time, there could be 24 different outlets. Who knows? It's going to be really interesting to see where this all goes.
As a seasoned reporter, if I can say that, Andy, a seasoned broadcaster, were you or were any of your colleagues, frustrated by some of the constant questions we heard over the last month or so? Not so much who should be the next chief minister, but more pertinently, I heard some first-time members, first-time elected, asked by various people on Thursday night, do you fancy it? As if somebody who's only been elected for the first time with no political experience would be given such a post. I mean, most won't even have a ministerial position initially if they desired, or would they? So how much do you think, does that frustrate you as somebody who has seen elections and traditionally you're not going to be in the running for chief minister without some experience?
I think that's the X Factor, isn't it? It's people who watch too much X Factor thinking they can literally walk in the front door and suddenly the next stop is to become chief minister. And that belies it that just shows the ignorance of the political process. And I just come back to the fact that we need to teach young people how the political process works. At least the fact of 24 MHKs, Legco, who else, the bishop, the attorney general, how all that works and how legislation works, and just make sure it's not boring, make sure that it's very routine and matter of fact. This is how it works. And then people accept politics as a way of life. I worry that there's a big sector of the population that just alienated from politics because they think it's boring and pompous and only for other people. And I think we've all got to work together to make sure that those people aren't left out.
Is politics pompous and boring, do you think, Sam, for people of a certain age?
It's boring. Let's face it, we know it is. You know, there's a lot of elements of politics are boring, but there's a lot of elements of all life that's boring. I watched Crystal Palace versus Brighton last night. It was pretty boring. Doesn't mean I'm not going to watch the Liverpool game tonight. You know,
the end wasn't, Sam.
Well, no, but that's kind of the point of politics, isn't it? You get 90 minutes of dullness, and then the last 2 minutes, everything happens. I think there's, I mean, the thing about chief ministers walking in the front door. I mean, I don't see why not. I mean, we've got 2 MLCs who have moved down who could do the job. They've become keys. Why not? You know,
really though. I mean, do you, and let me put it to you. You've been in MLC. Can somebody who's been in the, and by the way, if we're talking personal politicians here, the 2 former MLCs who've been sworn in today from Middle and Glenfaber and Peel, I would think will be part of the next cabinet. But are they really in contention to be chief minister when they've not even been a minister? Ewan, you've been in the upper chamber for a decade.
Yeah, that's right. It's an interesting question. It's whether they'd want to be, and I mean, a lot of people were talking about without getting too heavy into this, but they were talking about the likes of Ewan Watterson, and I said straight away, there's not a chance that Ewan Watterson's going to go for chief minister. He's a parliamentarian and he wants to be the speaker, and he has been elected today as the speaker.
He wants to be the president.
Well, yeah, but that wasn't to be this time round.
No, but that's what
I think, in fairness, though, he has a lot more to give yet before moving up to the president's role. But in terms of the chief minister role, you have to be very, very strong in that role. And I don't know whether they've got enough experience to carry it off. That's my own view. I did on election day, actually did an interview with the former chief minister, Tony Brown, and he was very, very forthright in some of his views about how the current ministers have not been controlled by the previous chief ministers, you know, where departments have been fighting against each other, because unlike the UK and the Isle of Man, they're separate legal personalities. So if you've got one minister in one department and a minister in another, the chief minister really can only fire them. He can't give them orders on how to run their department. So he was saying that he used to get them around the table and say, right, you know, you speak to you, sort it out, or I'm going to, you know, basically heads will roll. That's not happened over the last few years. So the chief minister has to be someone who, well, dare I say it, I think they need to be almost ruthless, because they've got a huge out of control civil service to sort out, and they need strong ministers in positions that are going to do their job. And if they don't do the job, then the chief minister's the one that's going to have to, well, you know, savage them.
Well, let me just start to wrap this up now. Then, by after everything I've just said about the constant question of who should be the next chief minister, we've now had the election. We know who the runners and riders are going to be, or the likelihood of who they're going to be. So let me put 2 questions to you. One is, who do you think will be the next chief minister? And secondly, while we're here today, Ewan Watterson has been re-elected as speaker this afternoon. He is the father of the house, of course, as the longest serving member. So should we accept that he's a parliamentarian, or should actually he have been putting the island rather than his own career first, and putting his name forward for a senior ministerial role and taking on a higher level of responsibility over the next 5 years? I'll put that to you, Paul, first.
Great, thanks. Ewan is, as I said just now, I don't think he wants to be chief minister. I think he's found his niche, which is doing speaker, and he'll then become president. I mean, let's face it, he wants to be the president. As of who's going to be the next chief minister, I'm chairing a debate. PAC are putting this on, and I will then tell you then, because I think it'd be unfair to say anything now, but I'll be dead interested to hear what the candidates will say. We think there's going to be 2, and we know there might even be 3, and it's well, the public here in the Isle of Man don't have any input whatsoever. At least it'd be nice to hear what their plans are. I mean, you know, I think everyone's got in their heads the obvious candidates and who's likely to get it, but you know, things can change. If you don't get a clear winner, somebody can come through the middle and take the job on, like Tony Brown basically did a few years ago. 2006,
of course. And Andy?
I think it'll either be Alf Cannon or Alex Allinson. They're the 2, the senior ministers. And as Paul said, the fact that there's this peculiarly folksy Manx way of choosing a chief minister after 24 have been elected, I think that's the beauty of the Isle of Man. I think the independence of political thought's important as well, although I'll be interested to see what happens to the Labour Party. It was interesting that the Greens didn't get anywhere. So it's Alf Cannon or Alex Allinson. And I think, Joe, I think you need a controlling speaker. I think a speaker needs a considered presence and a considered force, really. The speaker's a really important job, and I think Joan Watterson is in the right place.
Right, Josh?
It's not really my place to say really who I think is going to be chief minister, but I think it's someone definitely that I think will have made a bigger impact during the pandemic in particular. I think that has really brought leaders in particular to the forefront to show their kind of, stance on how they're going to deal with crisis and real situations. So I would say it's probably going to be someone that's really had the most impact during the pandemic.
So it'll be a current minister then?
Yeah, I would have thought so. Thought so. And only off the back of what people have been saying about the public vote, in particularly surprised to hear that the public didn't get a say in the chief minister. And I think that's something that surprised our audience as well in the Northwest, particularly hearing, the leader of the nation doesn't particularly, the public here don't particularly get a say on that. And in terms of the speaker, I'll just say I'm not surprised that Mr. Watson has gone. And that's all I'll say on that.
Very, very diplomatic. You should be a politician. Sam, your views on next chief and indeed on the role of speaker, which, as Andy says, is very important. But should we have expected more from the father of the house, or is that the right fit?
Okay, I could go on all night about this, so I'll try and do the whole thing in a minute. My first choice for chief minister, I've said, was Jane Poole Wilson, and I've said that repeatedly. I don't believe you have to have been a minister to be chief. If you want massive reform of the civil service that we need and reform of government that we need, I don't think it helps to have someone who's been there for the last 5 years. In terms of who will be chief, I think you're probably looking at Dr. Allinson or Mr. Cannon. I wouldn't be amazed to see Mr. Thomas come through the middle if it doesn't quite work out for either of them. And in terms of June Watson, I think he's got his niche as speaker, but I think there's an element for, I don't know, there's part of me which thinks he may not be speaker for too long. There could be something which opens up because he may be needed to shore up a government here or there, or even lead it maybe, possibly. He hasn't necessarily actually ruled that out if you read what he said. But I think in terms of his role as speaker, yeah, he's got a niche, but I think there's a time and a place for stepping up. And I think with a relatively young house and a relatively new house, there's an argument either way for whether he should stay in place and guide them through keys or whether he should step up and form part of the next government. But we'll have to wait and see. What nominations close on the 5th? We get a result on the 12th and see where we are in 2 weeks.
And finally, Drew, and then I'll just change the wording slightly after what Sam's just said. Should we have a chief minister who has no ministerial experience whatsoever? Because obviously we've just heard Sam put forward the credential of Jane Poole Wilson. And secondly, in terms of Joan Watterson, would he go for any other job, minister job, other than chief minister?
Well, to answer that question about, Sam said about Jane Poole Wilson, I mean, you read her manifesto, she's a big fan of big government, wanting to create lots of quangos. It's in her manifesto, arm's length. It's in there in print, Paul's smiling, but it's in there. Wants to create arm's length bodies and separation policy from, sorry, but as a voter, that's the last thing I want. I want more control from the ministers with the functions of the department, not less. Not putting them out to all these unaccountable quangos. We've just set Manx Care up, which, remember what happened when we set the Manx Electricity Authority up and made it arm's length and unaccountable. We ended up with millions of pounds worth of debt that we're still paying for. So I think it's important that we get somebody in there who's going to get a control of things. I'm not bothered about whether they've been a minister or not. It's about whether they're strong enough to do it. And we've seen people like David Ashford come in. Now, I know he's ruled himself out at the moment, but he came in, he was in Keys for 2 years and he went straight into Comyn. Many would have said, oh, well, that's too soon to be a minister, but he stepped up and really grasped that department and did plenty with it. Joan Watterson, of course, speaker. You mentioned Tony Brown. He was elected speaker, and then there was a lot of jostling going on where they couldn't then elect a chief minister, and he then jumped into that role. So it has been done before. Whether I think he will do it this time, I've got my doubts about that. Your question about, who do I think? Is it who do I think or who would I like? My choice.
Both. Give us both. We've just got time.
My choice would be Alf. Right now, Alf Cannon, I always said would be a chief minister. I also said at the time that Alan Bell would make a good chief minister, and he seemed to struggle controlling some of the ministers during his tenure. I don't know whether his in-tray was so busy he didn't have time to sort them out. But yeah, Alf Cannon. But I think what's going to happen is there is going to be this. There seems to be a bit of obsession at the moment with the whole, should we have the first female chief minister and all the rest of it. It should be about who's right for the job, not what gender they are. I mean, some of my favorite UK politicians are female, and I'm not going to say which parties they're in because that's a completely different discussion, but most people probably guess. But nevertheless, this is going to be, and everybody says it's an important 5 years coming up, but we need somebody who's going to get a rick on the ever-expanding civil service, sort the departments out that are constantly fighting with each other, and only somebody with a very strong character is going to be able to do that. And I believe Alf Cannon is the person who can do it, and also represent the Isle of Man with enough vigour when going off the shore and visiting various meetings off the island. Alf, I think, is the man, but it's in the hands of the 24 members of the Keys.
It certainly is. The 24 members of the Keys, who us collectively and many thousands of others have put their faith in for the next 5 years. It's been fascinating to talk to chaps. Thank you for your time. Josh from ITV Granada, Man in the Isle of Man, of course. Paul Moulton from Isle of Man TV. Sam, of course, from Jeff the Mongoose. Ewan, founder and broadcaster of Energy FM, and Andy Wint, Manx Radio's election guru, really, up at Douglas Head. Thank you for your time. Paul, I think you were just wanting to say something, were you?
I just want to thank you, James. I know you haven't been too well and you missed your big moment on the night and all that. Thank you for doing this. I'm on the RTS Isle of Man board. I know we're very short on time, so I just really want to make a plea. If you'd like to become a member of RTS Isle of Man, if you're in full-time education, you can have a free membership. So please really think about that. The media people coming up, join us. We want to keep RTS Isle of Man going and have a voice in the whole group and do more of these things. And again, thank you, James, for doing this tonight.
Oh, pleasure. Been great to catch up. Lots more we could say, of course we could. The Royal Television Society, as Paul says, membership open to anyone, number of benefits, rts.org.uk, go to membership, and there we go. We've got round to all of the questions, both from this end, but also from the viewers on Zoom. So thank you for your time. Good evening, one and all. Stay safe and goodbye.